Hello and welcome to Looking Through Luke, a YouTube series where we systematically work through one of the ancient biographies of Jesus known as the Gospel of Luke. My name is James and I'm so glad that you've found us. Whether you're a skeptic, a curious onlooker, or indeed a follower of Jesus, my hope is that together we would have a clearer view of who Jesus is, the claims that he made and what he did, and that along the way we might even meet Jesus himself. Feel free to ask questions or comment below as we learn together. I'm so glad that you're here, so let's jump into our next episode. Welcome to this week's edition of Looking Through Luke. So glad you could join me as we look at a really interesting part of this biography of Jesus' life written by the author and historian Luke, in order that those who read it might be certain of what we've read and have assurance that it's true. And in our journey so far, we've worked through the birth of Jesus and his childhood, and we're in this interesting transition point as Jesus is prepared, as he's readied for his ministry, his mission, which will unfold shortly. And that began with his baptism, and we pick it up today with Jesus being tested in the wilderness. He faces a series of temptations. And I'm really thankful that we see this part of the story here because it reminds us again that though Jesus is, as it says in his genealogy, the Son of God, he's divine, he's also human. And we know that through many different ways, and one of the ways we know it is because he too knows what it is to be tempted. I was recently tempted. I struggle with temptation all the time. I was in Melbourne, one of the big cities in Australia, and it was late at night and my wife had gone to bed and I was bored and I decided to go for a walk in the city, which I enjoy doing, and I came across one of those places that you should never come across late at night. And I stood there staring at this place for what felt like 20 minutes, trying to resist the temptation to order that large chicken and beef kebab. It was calling out to me. I'd already had dinner, but that kebab shop was singing its siren song, and suddenly I found myself hungry and very tempted to eat that kebab, despite obviously not requiring it for sustenance. Well, I managed to resist that temptation, but I don't always resist temptation. Sometimes I give into it, but I'm reminded today in this story that Jesus knows what it is to be tempted, and he knows what it is to resist that temptation. Let me read the story with you. It's from Luke chapter 4, and I'm going to read the whole passage, but we're actually going to break this story up into 2 episodes. So we're going to look at the first half today. We'll look at the second half next time. I think there's so much good stuff here for us to sink our teeth into and enjoy. Sink our teeth into. I'm obviously still thinking about kebabs. Let me read from Luke 4. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil then led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It's been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." And Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here, for it is written, He will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, 'Do not put the Lord your God to the test.'" When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. So firstly, we see that Jesus, the beloved Son, is led into the wilderness by God, where he is tested for 40 days by the devil. The devil is not, according to Luke, a mythical figure. The devil is real. The devil's described in the Bible as an accuser, as a tempter, as a personal foe. And in first century Palestinian angelology, this is the time in which Luke is writing his biography, the devil is depicted as real. And not only is the devil depicted as real, a realm where faithful and fallen angels exists is also real. And as I said a number of episodes ago, even if you struggle with the belief of the supernatural, just simply thinking about the fact that we exist in for example, a 13-dimensional universe allows in our minds the space, the possibility that spiritual beings exist and inhabit dimensions that we can only infer. We don't see or enter into fully ourselves. So if that's you, at least suspend your disbelief and allow the possibility. But for Luke, writing here, there's no question. The devil is an accuser, a foe, a tempter, and he leads Jesus out into the wilderness. It's really interesting that Luke places this account just here, right after the genealogy. You think, well, why would he do that? What has a list of names and a heritage got to do then with being tempted or tested in the wilderness? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, remember in our last episode we talked about how at the end of the genealogy, as opposed to Matthew, Luke takes the list of names right back to Adam, the first human. And it's through Adam, the Bible tells us, that sin entered into the world. Adam and Eve gave in to the temptation that was presented to them in Genesis 3. And so what Luke wants to do here is highlight a contrast between the first human and therefore in some sense the first Son of God. Adam was created by God. And contrast his failure and his giving in to temptation with Jesus, who Luke says in the genealogy is the Son of God, and who now faces temptation and resists, doesn't give in. He succeeds where Adam fails. And that's an important motif, it's an important thread through the biography where Adam fails and where the nation Israel, God's chosen people, fail. Jesus succeeds. And I think that's partly why Luke lets us in on the fact that Jesus has been taken into the wilderness. The wilderness, there's a great theological thread about the wilderness, but the wilderness represents, in some senses, Israel's failure. Israel are taken out of Egypt, they are given their freedom, their liberty, taken out of slavery, and they go into the wilderness, and they promptly fail to trust God for his provision. They give in to the temptations to take matters into their own hands, and so we see Israel's repeated failure. And where Israel failed, we'll see Jesus succeed. The success of Jesus, as we'll see here in the wilderness, reminds us not just of Israel's failure, but also reveals to us that Jesus is qualified to lead. He's qualified to bring about this spiritual transformation. The other really interesting thing about this account, I think, is that it shows us Jesus' unswerving allegiance to God. And we'll see through the biography that Jesus doesn't act according to his own agenda. He isn't pushing his way. He's on a mission that's given to him by God, and he continues to exhibit his allegiance to God. It's unswerving. Luke also points out that Jesus is led by the Spirit. He's full of the Spirit. He's led by the Spirit. This is God's work. This isn't Jesus's coming up with an idea and deciding. Jesus is spiritually sensitive to the work of God and the leading of God, and so he's taken into the wilderness, and we read where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. Now, some argue, we've got 3 temptations here. Was Jesus just sitting around in the wilderness for 40 days, and at the end of 40 days, then he was tempted? Or was he tempted throughout this 40-day period? Luke seems to indicate that this 40 days is a period of tempting. And we have 3 particular examples of what these temptations looked like. We read that he ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them, he was hungry. I love how Luke goes the extra mile for us to bring about that detail. He was hungry. Well, he hadn't eaten for 40 days. Of course he was hungry. It would be odd, wouldn't it, if Luke wrote he didn't eat for 40 days, and at the end of it, he'd hardly noticed. Of course he was hungry. But Luke wants to make the point again. Why does it matter that Jesus is hungry? Well, because he's human, and humans get hungry, but also because when you're hungry, you're vulnerable. Hunger is a sign of weakness in some senses. Give an example, right? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes I do the grocery shopping. Usually my wife does it because she's far more efficient than I am, and she buys the right things and I buy the wrong brands. But sometimes I do it. And I've learnt from hard experience, never go shopping just before lunch, right? You can go shopping any time of the day and you'll come out with exactly what you're after, exactly what's on your list. But if I go in 20 minutes before lunchtime, I come out and I end up looking at the stuff in my bags and think, why did I buy this? I didn't need these 4 packs of pies, but I was hungry. And I went in and it completely changed how I engaged in the shopping process. I got far more than I needed, and I bought things that I wouldn't otherwise buy. Well, Jesus is hungry. There's a sign of weakness there and vulnerability. And so the first of the 3 temptations that we're looking at plays directly into his hunger and his weakness. And we're going to look at this one, and then we'll finish for today. The devil says to him, if you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. Now, for you and I, that probably doesn't strike us as a typical temptation. I don't know what your stone turning into bread skills are like. Mine are pretty average. I've never been able to turn a stone into bread. I just haven't been able to do it. But clearly, if Jesus is the Son of God and he has access to supernatural power, and as we'll see through his biography, he performs many miracles and many demonstrations of miraculous power, this is within his capacity and within his power on authority to perform. Now, in asking the question, if you are the Son of God, the devil isn't actually challenging Jesus on that point. Jesus and the devil know that he's the Son of God. But he is challenging Jesus. Well, since you're the Son of God, and since you're hungry, and since it's been 40 days, surely it's right. And you should be able to take this into your own hands and produce bread. That's a good and reasonable thing to do. You might wonder, well, what's the temptation here? And I want to suggest that the temptation is that Jesus satisfies his hunger through miraculous means, and if he is to do so, then it brings into question God's provision and God's protection of Jesus. Remember, it is God by the Spirit who leads Jesus into the wilderness. Jesus is where he is supposed to be because God has led him there. And if God has led him there, then God knows after 40 days that Jesus is hungry, And Jesus has a choice. Will he trust God's provision and plan? Will he trust God's leading? Will he trust God's protection? Because the temptation is to question or to doubt, to act in a way that says, I don't believe that you have my best interests at heart. I don't believe you'll provide for me. I don't believe you'll protect me. And that is the quiet whisper of the devil here. Maybe God doesn't have your back. Maybe you need to look out for you. Friends, what I think we see here is actually an attack by the devil on God's goodness. And Jesus' response is very telling. His response in verse 4 is, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone. Now, Jesus is actually quoting the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. He's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And in that particular part of the Bible, the scriptures, the context is a call to Israel to remain fixed on God's faithfulness in delivering his promises and protection. God has delivered Israel out of Egypt, and now they're wondering, God, did you just bring us out here to die? And in Deuteronomy, there's this call to remain fixed on God's promises and on his faithfulness, that God will deliver what he's promised. Here we see another example of where Israel, God's chosen people, fail, and yet Jesus, God's one and only chosen Son, succeeds. So how does Jesus respond to this temptation in the midst of his hunger, in the midst of this challenge to turn a stone into bread, provide for his needs, which I think is an attack on God's goodness, that God doesn't have his back, that God won't protect him, that God's not in control? Jesus demonstrates a reliance and trust that what God says is true. That life is found in doing God's will. And friends, maybe you and I haven't been without food for 40 days. Maybe turning a stone into bread is not a realistic option for you and I. But talking to those of us who do follow Jesus, how often do we face a similar temptation? The temptation to take matters into our own hands. The temptation to doubt that God is for us, that God is good, that he will provide for our needs, that he will protect us. Because sometimes the circumstances around us would scream at us otherwise. And Jesus could look around in the middle of the wilderness and feel his hunger and begin to question, will God deliver? But in that moment, he declares to the devil what he knows to be true. God is good and sovereign. God has led him, and God will protect and provide for him. And friends, I think that's a great lesson for you and I. If you're not a follower of Jesus, then this story, I think, should give us hope too, that Jesus knows what it's like to be human. He knows what it's like to face temptation. And he demonstrates to us his authority and power in overcoming it by the power of God, and invites us in some ways to do the same with his help. So as you look at your life and you think about the struggles that you're facing, these are things we can place in God's care and choose to trust him with. So even if you're not sure whether you want to follow Jesus, I would say, why don't you do that? Why don't you take one of those things that you're struggling with and say, God, look, I'm not even sure I believe that you're real, but I believe enough to actually put it out there that maybe you would, by your power, help me resist and overcome this. Ask God to do for you what only God can do, and trust him. That's it for today. We're going to pick up the next two temptations in our next episode. There's still so much more to unpack. But thanks for joining us. I can't wait to see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to make a comment below. And if you did find the video helpful or interesting, please hit the thumbs up and give us a like, and click the bell notification and subscribe. It really helps us get these videos out to a wider audience. We're not trying to build a massive following or channel. We are simply trying to communicate the truth of who Jesus is from the Bible. So if that's something that you can get behind, we'd love your support by doing those two simple things. It really helps us out. Thank you and see you next time.